I'll record on this computer. Okay, so that is going. So let me start, guys, by saying that this entire presentation is going to be an exercise in new learning. Let's put it that way. What I'm hoping to be able to do today is show a lot of video clips. And so I just want to give you a heads up. If we find that having this many people on lowers the bandwidth too much, we might have to go to plan B. And I'm going to ask everybody for this part of the presentation, if you can also stop your video. And I don't see that many of you actually have it on today right now. But if you do, if you could also just stop your video, because that will open up more bandwidth so that hopefully we'll be able to bring in the video clips. I'll let you know when I'm done with the video clips, and if you want to show faces again and more important, see each other, you'll be able to do that. So today's topic is an interesting one that I think is really important for the time that we're in as a state, for the time that we're in as a country dealing with the COVID virus. And it's always a good reminder on top of that. What we're going to be doing is talking about the shoulders upon which we stand, or really the history of the peer support movement and how it has brought us to today. And I want to do that for several reasons. I think the most important is we get trained in our own classes, and if we don't find out about this long history and the pioneers, some of whom are still out there a lot, we can feel really alone and isolated, or feel like we're this solitary person in this new field, when really we have a long and rich history that works from the 1700s up until today. And knowing that you're a part of that, I think I'll just speak for myself, knowing that I'm a part of that changes how I feel about my work and about what I do and all of that.
So Lynn?
Yes, I'm trying to mute everybody. Go ahead. I think I just muted you, Shireen, sorry.
When you move, your audio is going in and out, so I just want to let you know you might need to get closer to the camera.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to mute everybody again. All right. So I want us to know how interconnected we are to many people and many years and many practices over the years. And so I'll start with saying that, of course, peer support is not new, right? Peer support, or at least informal peer support, has been around, I think, since humans have been around. It's a very natural thing to connect with those who have similar experiences. So it's been around in some form or another forever. What may seem new is peer workers in the mental health system. But actually, that's really not that new either. Some of us worked in the mental health system in this role, although it wasn't called the same thing, but we did it before there was any Medicaid funding. So we've been in the systems for many years as well. What really is new is that with the ability to fund Medicaid, we have grown exponentially in terms of working within Medicaid funded systems. So let me ask a poll, and you guys can just throw your answers in the chat box if you want. But the earliest known peer supporter, and this is in mental health services, was in. And so we've got 1999, 1829, 1976, 1795. Any takers? I'll give you a second to mull that over. 1976, thanks for playing. Thanks for playing. 1999, thanks for playing. 1976, again, thanks for playing. Any other takers? Oh, I got a lot of 1976s. Oh, I've got a brave one, 1829. Nice, thanks for playing. So it is going to be the outlier, and it is going to be 1795. And how do we know this? Well, we know this because we have writings, but we also have a painting. It's a very famous painting, actually. Oh, sorry, I've got my little animations. Isn't that unbelievable? Okay, so we have a painting, and this painting is known as Dr. Pennell, Unlocking the Chains of the Asylum. So that sounds good, right? And we've got Dr. Pennell there with this nice little hat and stuff. And Dr. Pennell is actually known as the father of modern psychiatry. But if we look, there's a guy back there who's actually unlocking those chains. And his name is Poussin. And that's French, so pardon my little nasally there. His name was Poussin. And he was somebody who had himself been in the institution. He had gotten better. And he went back and tried to advise Dr. Poussin and ended up working with him very, very closely for many years. And this was his principle. As you can see, this is a direct quote from him. And that he was really advocating and demanding under his watch that people that were working in our institutions do not use force and do not use violence against people. This philosophy and this partnership of Poussin and Dr. Pennell would create a big period of psychiatry history known as the era of moral treatment. And it was very successful. They had great outcomes. But when they didn't have enough funding and institutions got crowded again, they reverted to old ways. But this goes back all those years to the 1700s. This was his advice to Dr. Pennell, is that as much as possible, the servants, and by that he means the attendants or the workers, are taken from the category of ex-patients. They are far better suited for this work because they are usually more gentle, honest, and humane. So there is our first known peer support worker back in the 1700s. So I kid not when I say we have a very long and rich history. So why do we care about the history? Well, on top of, feeling not alone, there's also the fact that our yesterday really informs our today. It is the history that we have that brings us to what we do today. So it's worthwhile looking back and seeing where we came from so we know how to proceed forward. When we look at peer support, and I am looking right now, I don't know if I lost a slide or something, but we really have a tale of two systems. It may be the next slide, which is substance use and mental health, and they're very different. So I'm going to have to deal with them separately. So I'm going to start with mental health peer support, that we have a long history, a foundation, and a body of research that actually informs our best practices. Oh, here it is. I thought I had lost it. So it is a tale of two systems. And the way those systems are different impacts the way our peer support is seen and interpreted. In the end, that mutual thing of helping people by our experience is the same, but when people recover from different systems, there are uniquenesses just to those systems that they're recovering from, and that does impact how we see and perform our peer support. So I'm going to start by talking about the mental health side, and then we will talk about the substance use side. So let's start with mental health peer support. And this is where I am going to try to start bringing in some videos for you guys. Most of the clips are relatively short, just a few minutes. But as you listen, I want you to think about, what are you seeing these people talk about or do in these clips? How did they do it, and how does that have relevance for today? Okay, and we'll take breaks in between some of these to actually talk about these questions, but I want you to be thinking about that. All right, now goes the test. Will this work? Let's see. All right, so and this is where you're going to have to pardon me as I have to do some flipping from screen to screen. And if it's not the smoothest, I'm sorry. I'm trying to get better at this. So we'll see how this goes. All right, I'm going to start this clip and I'm going to stop it right away. And just, you guys let me know if you can't hear it. I won't just let it keep running. I'll run it about 30 seconds, or this is better. If it's not running okay, let me know in the chat. I have it up. All right, so let's just do a little bit of our history here.
I have found that sometimes our story is eloquently written by fierce advocates who survived mental institutions and at their own expense self-published their story. These ex-patient advocates emerged decades and even centuries before our modern ex-patient movement. Unlike today, where tens of thousands of us have joined together and found power in numbers, these first leaders in the ex-patient movement often worked alone and tirelessly to right the wrongs they had suffered in institutions. For instance, here is a memoir written by Elizabeth Packard and published in 1879. It is called Modern Persecution or Insane Asylums Unveiled. It tells the story of her involuntary incarceration at the Jacksonville Asylum in Illinois. This is Elizabeth and her husband. He was a Presbyterian minister. In her first-person account, Elizabeth Packard tells the story of being committed to an insane asylum because she did not hold the same religious beliefs as her husband. 100 years before Thomas Szasz, this brilliant and quick-witted woman wrote, quote, "Had I lived in the 16th century instead of the 19th century, my husband would have used the laws of that day to punish me as a heretic. In other words, instead of calling me by the obsolete title of heretic, he modernizes his phrase by substituting insanity instead of heresy as the crime for which I am now sentenced to endless imprisonment in one of our modern inquisitions," unquote. Up to the front doors of the very, very busy insane asylum in Jacksonville, Illinois.
Sorry, wrong place. There we go.
Elizabeth was able to secure her release from the institution. After holding a public trial, she was judged not insane by a jury. She then proceeded to petition legislators in 31 states to change the status of women with regard to commitment laws. This resulted in the passage of the Packard Laws to protect women from wrongful commitment to asylums by relatives hoping to profit from a woman's commitment. Here is the state hospital in Augusta, Maine. Isaac Hunt spent 3 years involuntarily committed to this asylum, and when he got out, he published his account of what happened. Isaac Hunt's book is called Astounding Disclosures: 3 Years in a Madhouse by a Victim, written by himself. It was published in 1852. In it, he writes, quote, "About the 9th day after I went into the asylum, I was again subjected to the horrid wildfire medicine, which was followed by the same terrible and strange sensations and wandering over the ward. I refuse to suffer this treatment. I refuse to take the medicine. The attendant insisted that I should, and harsh words followed. I told him the medicine was destroying me and I would not take it. He then commanded me in a tone of authority to take the medicine. I did take it. I took it from his hand and dashed it out the window. In a moment, this stalwart, muscular man struck me a violent blow upon my head. Unquote. Dr. Isaac Ray was the superintendent at the asylum in Maine when Isaac Hunt was a patient there. In the same year that Hunt published his scathing first-person account of the asylum, Dr. Ray wrote a paper in which he warns the brethren that, quote, the most prolific source of this distrust of hospitals for the insane is undoubtedly the communications of patients themselves, unquote. He goes on to discredit ex-patient narratives by saying that the insane are liars by nature. Quote, it is equally well known that no moral traits are so common among the insane as a total disregard of veracity, unquote. In this way, Dr. Ray began the long tradition of mental health professionals dismissing and discrediting first-person accounts written by ex-patients.
Ha! So what do you think of that, guys? I am going to, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good,
We're
thank you.
just all muted.
I wasn't sure. This is my first time at all this flipping back and forth, so I wanted to make sure. So
Yeah, you're doing very well. It's good.
great, thank you. And so just to let you know, on the slides, you will see exactly how to get to these clips and the specific clips that I used. I will tell you now that this series called Politics of Memory is done by a more recent pioneer who we will also talk about later. Her name's Pat Deegan, and she put together a 5+ hour history of everything about the mental health treatment system and about the work of advocates over the years. So that will be available for you to easily access. Powerful stuff, is it not? And so in the chat, just take a break here for a moment. In the chat, what did you see that Elizabeth Packard and Isaac Hunt did that is part of our legacy? What did they do? How did they do it? And how does that have relevance to our practice today? And, you know, I was expecting a few hundred. We seem to be much smaller at 59. So I would say, you know, if you want to unmute yourself and make a comment, feel free to do that too. We have a few minutes instead of just the chat, so you can hear each other, not just me. But I will share, people have written back here, thank God they fought back. They spoke up for the unheard, not conforming to silence. What else did they do? Did they do anything else? Well, Elizabeth Packard fought and changed laws, right? Those Packard laws are in place today. That's why you can't just have a family member, for a woman or a man, just say, yeah, my kid's crazy, or my wife or my husband or partner, they're just crazy, lock them up, right? So they're not being used very well, but You still do have to see a doctor before you can be institutionalized. Now, have we perverted the intent? Yes. So maybe part of what it says for the relevance for our practice today is that we have to keep going on things like that, right? Because for everything we get done, we always have to redo it, right? Martha is also mentioning the rich heritage of refusing medication. Yes, that is also true, and that was updated with the Rosie laws of the 70s, where we again got our right to refuse medication. Again, it gets perverted, and we have to keep trying, but all of these are sort of pieces of the foundation that we build on from what they did before, right? And it's an ongoing journey, but at least we have these great folks who have sort of led the way for us. So let's go on to something next. So these roots that we talked about here, they also told their story, right? So important that we keep telling the stories, because although the mental health system doesn't look today like it did then, my guess is in 20 years, even the people that think it's okay today will look back and go, oh my God, we thought that was okay. We get immune to things, and it's only by bringing them to light do we start to change opinions about them. So those were just a couple of the many in the 17 and 1800s that wrote these books and really tried to force change in our mental health systems. Our history is first and foremost a civil rights history and a human rights history, that people, by virtue of having a psychiatric diagnosis, have and continue to lose their rights, their dignity, and their ability to just live a decent life. And so that's one of the first foundations that we build on. So we stand on their shoulders, and thank you to them. All right, I'm not going to bring you through all the 1700s and 1800s. We would be here for 4 hours. So I'm going to sort of fast forward us up to the more modern iteration of this movement. And that brings us into the 70s or the 60s, really, of last century. And again, think about, I'm going to play some clips again and think about, you know, what are they doing? How are they doing it? And how do we bring that into today? All right, so let me go, and I'm going to stop sharing screens again and switch over to my other, whoops, wrong way. Oh, it went so well the first time. Okay, there we go. Okay, number 2, here we go.
And I thought, I guess I have TB, you know. I mean, I didn't even know what it meant.
Lynn, you have to share your screen.
Oh, I thought I did. I didn't. Okay, sorry. Thank you. I appreciate the help. Problem is, I've got so many screens up, it's hard to find even the screen that gives me the ability to share the screen. There we go.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. As I say, I appreciate the help.
Because I was really sad and lonely and had overdosed. And then this, like, I guess I have TB, you know. I mean, I didn't even know what it meant.
what was day one like for the mental patient liberation movement, or the consumer movement, or whatever they want to call it nowadays?
Well, day one was when there was a woman by the name of Dorothy Weiner, who was living in Portland, Oregon, who had this idea that the way she was treated in mental hospitals and the way other people were treated in mental hospitals wasn't right, and that there were better ways that people should be treated, and there were alternatives that people needed to be created, alternatives to mental hospitals, to the psychiatric system. And later on, she got some articles printed in a local underground paper called the Willamette Bridge, and brought together some people in a group called the Insane Liberation Front. This was in late 1970, early 71. And basically, they tried to distribute literature in mental hospitals, and they had an 11-point program, because a lot of people had 10-point programs, and that's different. An 11-point program that involved things like an end to involuntary commitment, an end to forced drugging, information about medications, alternatives, which she would call freak-out centers that are now called drop-in centers or client-run centers. A lot of the same things that the movement is believing in now. She got the group started, and I was living in Eugene, Oregon at the time, which isn't too far from Portland, and went up to Portland to meet her, and was I found my calling. My whole life changed at that point, and I decided that this would be what I would do for the rest of my life. Went back to New York City, started the Insane Liberation Front in New York City, printed an article called the Insane Manifesto in a very new paper called the Radical Therapist Journal. It was new at that time, coming out of Boston. And later on, we changed the name of the organization to the Mental Patients Liberation Project, which got some national media attention, and then groups started springing up all around the country. Dorothy, we tried to stay in touch with her. Several years later, we learned that she had died, and that she never really knew, because we could never reach her. She never really knew that what she had started had grown into what is now an international movement.
There were huge numbers of people in institutions at that time, and the conditions under which they lived were, number one, they were used as forced labor. Many of them were shock treated, many of them forced with medications, and also many of them were no investigations or no real reasons as to why people were dying. The Network Against Psychiatric Assault put out a newsletter called Madness Network News that started to go out all over the country, and joined other inmates, other survivors, if you will, people that were being deinstitutionalized and were gathering in different cities.
I first heard about
All right. So let me get back to the right screen again of the slides, and we will chat again. All right. So again, in the chat box, if you guys would, what did you see that they did? Oh no, it's gonna, all right. What did they do? How did they do it? And how is that relevant for today? Because in a way, it's a different time. And yet, how different is it, I guess, is my question. Sorry for any of those who get dizzy by this. There we go.
Yeah, so Leanne Greer said they followed through. Somebody else said they did publications in the media, they found their voice, they organized.
Indeed. And that goes back to the whole idea that this is a civil rights history, but it also is a time where we start to see, and this is what Gail talks about, is that people that were coming out of long-term stays in institutions, and this is in part because of the time that it was when they were, what they were calling is deinstitutionalizing, is that people were connecting with each other, and they were finding out that from each other, we actually can learn how to be well, how to get well and how to stay well. And it was really the beginning of this movement where people go from just talking in isolation, sharing their stories, trying to change the system, to saying, well, there's another piece to this. It's not just changing the system, it's about what can we do together for ourselves. What can we learn from each other, and how can we bring this true peerness? And if we look at the word peer, of course, in the dictionary, it's about that equal level where no one has power over the other. And we go to this relationship to share what's helped me because it might help you, and vice versa. So it was really the beginning of that. There was still the advocacy wing, there was still the activism that was out there, really still trying to change the inequalities within the mental health system and the lack of rights, of human rights and of civil rights. But there was also now the second branch that came into be of where people started to really look to themselves as a community. And so we're going to look at another video that really kind of summarizes sort of 20 years of this work, all through looking at the history of Judy Chamberlain, who is really one of the grandmothers of our current movement. Judy passed away, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, but she fought right up until the end, really trying to change the system, but also trying to bring us together as communities to be more forceful together and to change each other's lives together. This video is going to run about 5 minutes, so just give you that heads up, it's a little longer. So I'm going to switch over again. I hope this is where it gets confusing because I have too many windows. There we go. Let's get rid of you. Say goodbye, Joe. We'll get back to you later. And let's do Judy. Okay. Now I'm going to share my screen again. If any of you listening are good at like video production, boy, could we use that so that we don't have to do this form of it? So let me know. All right, let me share the screen again. And
You got it, Lynn.
great. Okay, and here we go with Judy.
We have a moral imperative to fight for justice. I believe we really have no choice. In 1966, in severe emotional distress after a miscarriage, 21-year-old Judy Chamberlain was committed to a psychiatric hospital. Judy quickly discovered that once she became a patient, it was nearly impossible to regain her freedom. She was told that she would never be able to live outside an institution.
The day that they took my own freedom away was the day that I dedicated myself to this cause. I said, this is wrong. This is wrong. This should not happen to anyone.
Judy defied her prognosis and went on to help found what is known as the Psychiatric User, Survivor, and Ex-Patient Movement. It was the heady era of civil rights, consciousness raising, women's liberation, and gay liberation. Judy drew courage and inspiration from these popular movements. By 1971, she was working with the Mental Patients Liberation Project in New York, and the rest, as they say, is history.
I first actually read On Our Own when I was in a mental health residence, and I found the book in the library. And it was like discovering a magical escape tunnel from the psychic prison that I was in.
People are still being punished for being in pain and for feeling their pain and for trying to speak their pain. And that's why there's such an enormous need for alternative crisis facilities that we need to develop. Because, yeah, it is hard to be around somebody who's not sleeping or crying all the time or screaming or tearing at their flesh or whatever. What's so important is to try to connect people with that this is real and this is what's happening to them and this is what they are feeling.
The user survivor movement has certain basic principles, and these are overarching. They vary from organization to organization around the world, but they basically fall into certain major categories. And the main one is that we speak for ourselves, that other people may claim to speak for us, but no one can speak in our voice. Our own voice is our own authentic voice, the voice of people who themselves have been labeled. That freedom and self-determination are basic human rights that must not be eroded or ended because of a medical diagnosis.
And like the farm workers and like the Black people in the segregated South, people labeled with mental disabilities are largely invisible to the wider world. To the extent that they think of us at all, they usually think of us as a problem that somebody has to do something about, and not as human beings, individuals, each one of us deserving of human dignity.
We are now living in a time of a historical shift, where people with mental illness, like other groups that have historically been without power, are in the process of claiming our right to self-determination.
For the rest of her life, Judy worked tirelessly with other users and survivors of psychiatry to achieve human rights, self-determination, and non-coercive alternatives. She also built many bridges with the cross-disability movement. Her legacy lives on today in an international movement of people who work to realize the courageous vision that she and other pioneers set in motion nearly 40 years ago.
And the slogan of the disability movement worldwide, I think, best sums up what it is that we want, what it is that we believe is just, and what we believe that will ultimately prevail, which is nothing about us without us.
I had the privilege of working with Judy in Boston, and privilege is an understatement for what it was. All right. So what did they do? How did they do it? And does it have relevance to practice today? And think about that last question, because when we became a funded service inside of institutions, we lost touch with that part of us, which was that activist in the streets role. And while we can all do that and should be still doing that, I would also say that that legacy is as relevant in our work as peer supporters within traditional mental health services. So my question might be, how do we do that? How do we take those messages that come so forcefully, nothing about us without us? Human rights are everybody's rights, whether you have a diagnosis or not. Choice, not force. I agree, Martha. I love that sign. How do we bring that into our work today as a Medicaid-funded peer worker? And if you want to unmute and offer some thoughts, please feel free to do that. The only answer I won't accept is not possible. Come on, guys, work with me. So thank you, NY Bell. We try to tell everyone that peer support is voluntary, right? And if our services are not doing that, then we educate those services that this is not a forced relationship, right? That peer support is always voluntary. And that we share with people what we can offer, and if they want it, come on along. If not, they don't have to. What else can we do?
Yeah, Lynn, I'm seeing everything from educating leadership on the history of the movement and what peer support really is, to challenging forcive and coercive treatments in the organization. Sharing our own lived experience with people is important. Education, helping people find their voice.
Yep. And these are not easy in our current roles, but it doesn't make them impossible. And I think one of the hardest skills for any of us to learn is how to do that as a bridger as opposed to an activist, because that's what our current roles, if we take on that role to work within the mental health system, that role is a role of a bridger. And so we have to do that in a way that is skillful and knowledgeable, going from the place of story and personal experience so that the people can hear the message that we're bringing forth. It's a lot harder than being on the streets protesting, although I highly support that as well. I wish we had more of that in this day and age, but we can do it within as well. It's just harder. And I'm seeing Brian here, which is a great thing, that there's different levels of advocacy that we do, right? Advocacy for the self, teaching people how to be self-advocates when we're supporting them, right? Supporting families to also be advocates, bringing families and people together. And then, of course, the bigger system and the statewide grassroots work, right? So we always have to be thinking about, where does this history bring us? What does this history teach us? And how can we take that into what today's opportunities offer us? Because we're not in the same time, but we have the same issues, right? And so being at tables, helping decision makers, not just agreeing for the sake of easiness, but saying that sounds good, but really that's not consistent with our history or who we are. If we're going to make policies, then we've got to do it consistently, right? So it's a lot of hard work. I say to people often that the role of the peer worker is one of the most complex, difficult, and nuanced positions that there are, not only in the mental health system, but just about anywhere, because it's asking us to ride that place of bridging, delivering hard messages in a nice way. And I'll tell you, I suck at it. Being able to work with the folks that are getting services there, but also being able to work with the providers, and really being that conduit who can make things change without getting fired. And go ahead.
Lynn, I think of it as a few different levels. So there's the supporting somebody to find their voice and be their own best advocate, because while advocacy is great, there is nothing more powerful than self-advocacy. The other layers within your organization, educating, advocating for change on the way people are viewed, the way people are treated, on the organizational language, the culture, the practices. So being a great steward within your organization of lived experience. And then there's a whole systems level. So a lot of what we see in the provider community is because of regulations and requirements and rules, even outside the providers. And so that's where we're getting into more policy, legislative change, social justice issues people with lived experience have to be at all different levels of those things. And we can choose which one, maybe all, maybe a couple that we're really good at. Some of us may be good at all of them. Some of us may be good at really connecting with people and helping them find their voice, but policy is not our thing. That's okay, as long as we have leadership from within at all of those different levels to make the system, to help the system shift along with the recovery principles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the point that you made, Shireen, that we figure out where are my strengths and where can I contribute the most, right? Most of us can't do all of it well. And so it's really knowing where can I contribute the most and be the most helpful and choosing those places. I think another of the downsides of getting a Medicaid funded position is that has become almost the one and only place that we go now, instead of really having the vibrant network that we had back in the 70s and the 80s. And for those who haven't heard the sort of the title that we put on that whole big movement, it's called the Consumer Survivor Ex-Patient Movement, or more commonly known as C/S/X, that movement. But they were more in the community with each other. And once we really became a Medicaid funded position, the community pieces fell apart. So we built something great, we accomplished something we wanted, and then unfortunately left some of the rich traditions that got us there behind. And that's another reason to think about this history, is how do we reclaim some of these things from the past that really help? What you saw with Judy and with some of the earlier folks is that it was a more radical time. Joe Rogers, that I'm going to play next, he's going to tell you more of that transition from just being the outside activist to some folks that were more midline, who wanted to work more with systems and try to have more of a influence by working with the systems, working within the systems, not just being activists outside the systems, all of which are great, right? Everyone has a place that sort of builds the foundation. When we have all the pieces together, it works the best. So let me pull up Joe. Go back to over here. Goodbye, Judy. And we'll go to Joe, and let me share my screen. Man, I need a little checklist of what my steps are to get to all of this. Back there, share screen. Oh, Joe. All right, here we go. Joe Rogers is another one of our pioneers. He is still alive and kicking. Joe has done some great work. He runs a center in Philadelphia, been really part of the whole movement in Philadelphia with his wife, Susan Rogers. Let me just check my thing so I remember what I'm playing here. Beginning to what? Okay, to 221. All right, here we go. All right, Joe.
Association of Southeastern Pennsylvania. When we first started organizing as an organization, self-help groups and mutual support groups, and eventually peer-run or consumer-run organizing efforts, we didn't really even use the term recovery. We mostly talked about the idea being a voice and empowerment. We talked about it primarily as an empowerment movement. The idea was that people who had diagnoses of mental illness, who for the most part had been treated in mental hospitals, needed to be and should be living in the community, and living in the community with their full dignity and fully integrated in the community. And those of us with diagnosis, I have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, began to do some organizing. We began to come together in small groups back in the 70s, the original organizing efforts had some pretty radical names. They called themselves the Mental Patients Liberation Front, or the Front for the Liberation of Mental Patients, because the idea at the time was growing pretty much out of the civil rights movement, the 60s and 70s, and the idea that discrimination was what kept people down, kept people from realizing their full potential. So those are the early days of organizing. Some of us who weren't quite as anti-psychiatry in our approach, but had more of that what we needed to do was get involved in reforming the system, making the system more responsive to the individual, but still basically a system of mental health care. Started calling ourselves the consumer movement. And we use the term consumer because it came from the idea of, like Ralph Nader's consumer union, the idea of people who had choices or were trying to make choices when it came to the services that they utilized or consumed. Other names that we now use are peer support, mutual support, the mental health clients group in California. So there are different names that people find to use, but the idea in history was one of asserting our civil rights and organizing for civil rights. Here in Philadelphia,
so Joe mentions California as well, and the movement, like many things in this country, started in the Northeast and in California almost simultaneously. Don't know how that happens, but it usually does. And I don't know that this particular movement moved into the center of the country as much as we usually find movements doing. It stayed more of a coastal movement, at least during the more radical years of it. There's another woman, and there weren't any good clips of her, so I don't mean to leave her out, but Sally Zinman, who's really the Judy Chamberlain of the West Coast, and has also been active forever and is still active today for the same causes. So we've seen it on the two coasts, and not so much in the middle or the southern part of the country for this movement. So that's why we only have video clips from those areas, because that's really where the movements were centralized. But what we got from all that work of people across the continuum is that we really started to see the mental health system begin to shift. And we started to see this idea of recovery values, and that is a term that we stole from the substance use side of things. They coined the term long before we did, but we stole it from them. And we started to really think about bringing recovery values, that recognition that people do get better, because that is another one of the key contributions of these folks, is they came out of mental hospitals where they had been put in and told, you will be here for most of your life, you will not have a life, and you will not get better. You have a chronic disease that just is not going to get better. And what they found for themselves and started letting the system know was, sorry, we actually do get better. Right? And so that whole idea of recovery came from the peer community and eventually immersed itself back into our systems, which is really exciting, right? So I think when we look at the current and the ways that it hasn't changed and the work that has to be done, it feels insurmountable. But when we do look back in the past and see it in a more macro level, we do get the opportunity to see that things have changed. And I'll just share a tiny bit of my story, but to let you know that my first hospitalization was in the state hospital in 1971. And they still had those god-awful mesh bar screens on all the windows, and people locked up in cages. And in fact, on my ward, if you did something bad, i.e. you were non-compliant, you got sent to one of the wards where the men were kept in cages to wash the floors while the men would urinate on you. That was 71. So have we moved? We have. We have terms like recovery. We have terms like recovery values. We have peer support roles in our services right now. So we've inherited a lot, and of course it doesn't mean we're done.
You can leave this in here.
So somebody's trying to talk, or is it just an...
Yeah, there's background. Somebody, everybody mute your background, please.
Thank you. So we do have, we've made strides, and we have a lot more to go. But we have a history, a rich and vibrant history. We have a foundation, and it says that our job is as peer supporters, but also as change agents, and that we may work in, but we never work of the system. If we become the system, we no longer are value to our role, and that we work within and beyond the mental health system, right? So I want to leave you with one last clip on the mental health side. And this is from Pat Deegan and bringing it into today. Pat Deegan is the one, she was the narrator on those early films. But let's catch up to Pat now. And then I'm going to transition over and talk about substance use. So let me switch.
Can everybody please mute yourselves?
Hi, Denise. My name is Anna Fiskus, and I am a peer support specialist at Promise Resource Network, and I'm calling to make a referral for someone that I support.
Let me mute
Anna.
Sorry, guys.
8817.
Give me a minute. I'm going to go back to that screen. All right, everybody, I'm going to mute you all again. And,
it's okay.
And what is your client's last name and the last 4 digits of their social if you have it?
Nope. Anna.
I'm trying to mute everybody. It's not working.
Thank you. We got it.
Okay, thank you. All right, now back to my video. All right. Too many screens. All right, here we go.
So he felt like he knew my future. He had read a generic textbook and simply applied it to the case in front of him. Schizophrenics don't recover, Pat Deegan won't recover. And it was that simple. And he urged me to go into a halfway house and to go on Social Security and to essentially retire from life. And then I remember having a thought, and I had never had this thought before, but the thought came to me, I'm going to become Dr. Deegan and change the mental health system so that no one ever gets hurt in it again. Wow, that thought had never come to me before. And yet it held me with a power. It became for me what I call a survivor's mission. In my own understanding of it, I believe that I have been called by a power greater than myself to do the work that has become my life work. I do not tell that to psychiatrists or treatment teams when I meet them. Miss Deegan, if I had gone to the treatment team then, Miss Deegan, what is your goal for your treatment planning this year? Well, doctor, I have been called by God to change the mental health system so that no one ever gets hurt in it again. Delusions of grandeur. Up the Hello Paradol. So I kept this new dream, this new survivor's mission to myself. It became mine. It became something that around which I could organize my recovery. And I think that this is so important, that you can't organize a recovery around a vacuum. You can't organize recovery around nothingness. We need to organize our recovery around something that has meaning, something that has purpose, something that gives us a sense that I can begin to move.
So that was Pat many years ago when she was talking about her early days of recovery and what the doctors might say. Let me share one last thing of Pat and what she's doing today. So I just stopped sharing. I think I can do it this way. Oh. Bring that down. Okay, now I can go to that one and go back there and share again. Oh, I get to share so much today. I'm so happy. There we go.
And so it always feels, we've been using that Sisyphus image, it feels like very...
Hold on, sorry.
Neighbor's upset. And I would say, I can't think clearly on this medicine. And he would say, but you're not thought disordered. And I would say, I feel like the meds are controlling me. And he would say, no, you're more in control. And I would say, I'm not myself when I'm on this medicine. And he would say, you have returned to baseline. And for me, this chasm is dramatic. Okay, this chasm, there is absolutely no common ground on which my doctor and I are standing with some vision of where we're trying to get with treatment. My doctor is treating a disease. He's not treating me, a person. And he considers the fact that he had been able to stabilize me and maintain me without recidivism in the community as an outstanding outcome. For me, it was a treatment failure. Something dramatic had to begin to change in order for me to be able to regain my life and to move on and achieve the things I wanted to do in my life. A radical change needed to happen in how my doctor and I worked together. And I've devoted my life's work to trying to understand how those of us with diagnoses of major mental disorders can find common ground so that this kind of profound loss of years and human potential does not occur. And I can tell you without a doubt that this treatment gap that I'm showing you here occurs routinely in psychiatric care. This is not at all unusual, where the prescriber sees as their job the treatment and stabilization of a medical condition at the expense of an individual's quality of life. Or I would even say life, period. So my work has been about finding a way to create common ground between us so that we can agree on where we're trying to get to. So over the last few years, I've developed a web application that's been created by and for people in recovery from mental health disorders. And we're creating this web application for folks with psychiatric disorders. We consider ourselves disruptive innovators. We know that to bring the voice of the individual to the center of the care team is going to disrupt practice as usual. And although it's the right thing to do, it's not always the welcome thing.
So although it's the right thing to do, it's not always the welcome thing. Dr. Deegan, I will now say, did in fact go on and become exactly what she said back then she would do, and that was to devote her life to changing the mental health system so that people would not be hurt in it anymore. Now, Pat has not totally succeeded in that, but this idea of disruptive innovator is one of the ways that we bring all of those lessons from our history and our tradition into 2020 and whatever the hell 2020 is going to look like when we get back to work after the days of COVID and start getting back into routines. How do we carry this legacy of being disruptive innovators? And so I think that the lessons that we have that can carry us are powerful, and that trying to work in a vacuum without knowing this rich history is a disservice to us, a disservice especially to the folks in systems, and a disservice to the system itself. What we learn from all these great histories, and let me make this big screen again, it was just too hard going back and forth. You can probably see that better, is that we are experts by experience. And the key things that we do is we share ourselves to inspire hope in others, because that is going to probably carry more weight than anything else. But also that from our lived experience, we can recognize and tell others what doesn't work and ways to change the practice. Educate through others through the use of our own experience, and by God, agitate, even if you have to do it nicely, depending on your role. But agitate, agitate, agitate. That is the traditions from which we come. And so when we look at this mental health side of peer support, it has been and continues to be a legacy of trying to move from oppression to advocacy, from isolation to working together, from acceptable tyranny to human and civil rights, and from being seen as incompetent by virtue of having a biological brain disorder to people that are badass world changers, right? That is the legacy that we carry with us and carry into the future. When I started to put this presentation together, my expectation and sort of the direction I was going was to then say, well, let's look at the addiction side and see how parallel it is, or just identify the ways that it's different, but also parallel. And I was going to get quotes similar and so forth. The problem is there's not the same kind of history written from the voice of folks that have experienced it who are outside the system. It's an entirely different system. It's a system that has been a system of neglect. And what that means is that in the history of addictions and substance use throughout the millennial, the history really comes from the people that themselves had found ways to find recovery and have tried to create different mutual aid support groups that help with that. The actual addiction system of care didn't come about until the 60s. So it's actually an opposite history. It's a history where people with lived experience have been the helpers all along. And then finally in the 60s, there was some recognition that substance use is not just a moral failing, but instead does have some physiological bases, and that it needed to be a partnership of the medical community and the people that bring their expertise from experience. So I put together a couple of videos, and I'm finding myself torn because these are not from the voice of a person who is in a role that's similar to our peer role. It's a sort of, I would call the guru on the addiction side, on all things history, all things from every angle of what living with and trying to recover from substances over the centuries has been. His name is William White, and he's been a leader also in trying to organize the contemporary, and by contemporary I mean sort of since the 90s, of peer recovery centers in addiction, of recovery houses, all the things that we're seeing really take hold in North Carolina. It's really been I would say the academic leanings of Bill White that's really been able to bring and articulate and share how those things have been done and how they're being done. But he put out like an 11-hour series, and I listened to a lot of it last night because I know loosely the history, but I found a couple of clips. I don't know, they're just so different. I feel like now that I'm at this point, I don't know how helpful they'll be. So I'm going to leave the clips in there. And for those of you on the call from substance use, I know, I'm sorry, I should have paced it better, but it's a real struggle to bring the two together. And I think what's important about that is that on the substance use side, people with lived experience have always driven the process. They haven't had the same stigma of you're an ex-mental patient, so you can't think straight. And instead, they've gotten the medical community shunning them. So they've had to go, we're almost like strands of DNA weaving around each other, but from different places along the history. And what that means is that ultimately the folks that we're serving come from different systems. And so the way that we serve them is different. Both mental health and substance abuse has a history and a foundation, but they're very different, right? And they also have a body of research and best practices, but they're also very different. In the end, peer support in any system is peer support, that mutuality of I've been there, I've done it, because I've been through the system that you're struggling with. And I think North Carolinians struggle with how do we, or I wouldn't say North Carolinians, it's just because that's where we're talking about. Throughout the country, we struggle with how do we bring the similarities of such different histories together while also recognizing and honoring the vast cultural difference from the different sides. And they truly are different cultures. And so I think my takeaway point, just because we're almost out of time too, is that none of us is a peer supporter. It's that peer support is a relationship between people with shared experiences. My primary experience was in the mental health system. So I have a lot to share about living through that system. I also have long-term sobriety through 12-step, but I didn't go through the substance use side of the system. So there's many pieces of that that I don't have and can't share. And so it's really that matching of how can we best match what we individually bring to the table from the roads that we've taken to be able to support others. So let me ask, we've got about 10 minutes left. We can go back and listen to some of Bill White and hear a little bit about the history of mutual aid in substance use, or open up to questions and thoughts. What would you all like to do? Shireen, any thoughts?
I'm interested in hearing from people.
Yeah. What was the question? Okay, Faith. Well, I was saying that in the 10 minutes we have left, I could play some of the William White video that talks about the history of mutual aid in substance use, or we could take the 10 minutes to talk amongst ourselves and share our thoughts on what we've covered. And what would, okay, I see talk. And a question, who was the person? Oh, that was me who coined that term, Abby. Yes, a badass world changer. That was mine. I was also getting a little punchy trying to pull it all together because there's so much in these two worlds. So yeah, so I'm hearing a little also request for William White. Why don't we take 5 minutes and hear a little bit? It is a rich history. It's just so different. And I think we need to have a week on that rich history as well. Trying to bring them together is really challenging. All right, let's do that, and we'll come back for the last couple of minutes. All right, so that means I got to go back to my old screen sharing again. I can do it one last time. I know I can. Okay, and let me do this. I'm going to be an expert by the time we get to the end. And I tell you, this series that he does is so good. And you'll see that the link is there for this one, but it's one of 11.
To set the stage for this discussion, I first want to acknowledge just how far back recovery goes historically in what we know as the United States. Organized recovery, as I've researched it, dates in the United States to the 1730s, and a series of Delaware prophets who, behind their own recovery from alcoholism, organized abstinence-based cultural and religious revitalization movements, the largest of which will later be the Handsome Lake movement that will evolve into the Longhouse religion, which continues to exist today. The central tenet of the Handsome Lake movement was a rejection of alcohol and a rejection of all other European folkways, and a return to native traditions and native folkways. We see behind the Handsome Lake movement a long series of prophet movements. The Shawnee prophet and the Kickapoo prophet that's going to then in the late 1800s emerge in the form of the Indian Shaker Church and the Native American Church. And we could actually continue this history forward within Native communities through the 20th century with the rise of culturally indigenous sobriety movements, including the beginning Indianization of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1950s, the emergence of the concept of the Red Road in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and the emergence of the contemporary Wellbriety movement that has rapidly spread through Native communities in the United States. If we look at Euro-American communities, organized recovery really dates to the 1830s. As people today we would know as alcohol dependent began to seek out early temperance societies and use those societies as a framework. I've actually got the first collection of recovery case studies in the United States in a pamphlet from 1833 by Sigourney and Smith that virtually catalogs these sort of reform case studies in the pre-Washingtonian years in the United States. In April of 1840, 6 men that were part of a drinkers club in Baltimore, Maryland, were sitting around one evening as they did every evening, drinking and debating. And the debate this evening was on the proposition that all temperance lectures were hypocrites. And they decided that since there was a lecture on temperance that very evening, they would send out a subcommittee to research this. Can you imagine this happening? I think we probably could. The subcommittee goes, here's the lecture, comes back, a lively discussion ensues, and the upshot of that is a decision that they should start their own temperance society, but only for hard cases. Now, the term alcoholism hasn't yet been coined, but hard cases was the contemporary term for what we would later call alcoholism. That movement grew from these 6 men to more than 400,000 people within 48 months, and then almost disintegrated overnight. And the alcoholics in that movement went underground and began to organize fraternal, recovery-focused fraternal of their societies. There may actually be a few of those groups still around. I will leave you to make that call. By the time we get to the 1870s, we have a new recovery framework emerges, which is the Ribbon Reform Clubs that's going to begin in the Northeast and rapidly spread south and begin to spread then into the Midwest. We're going to get other groups like the Dashaways in San Francisco. One of my favorite groups is the Drunkards Club in New York City. The point that I want to make here is we have a very large number of pre-AA alcoholic mutual aid societies. We also had societies emerge within the context of a growing network of addiction treatment programs.
He's going to start talking about treatment again. And that's what gets so hard with this, is it's so intermixed. But I have one more clip I want to play of William White, who talks more contemporary. And basically what happened in the substance use world, which is why I always call it a system of neglect, is up, all the mutual aid societies were going strong until about the 1930s, when there was just politically and everything else, all of this energy that started to say, nobody gets better, and the only way to deal with this is to criminalize it. And so we had the prohibition acts coming in, and everything went, except for AA, went underground for years and years and years. And then treatment started to emerge in the 60s. But there's just been all of this no funding, or a little bit of funding, and then we're going to take it away, and constantly going back to that mantra that addiction of any form is a moral failing and not worthy of our time or our money. And so it's only been in the last number of decades that we actually see this sort of treatment and the voices of lived experience trying to work together, because finally there's a dedicated treatment system. So I want to just play that end piece from Bill. And, I do a thing called the a tale of two systems. And in that, you can see how the systems really play off of each other. The peer support is what's so different, because that piece has been there all along for addictions. That's what it's built on, and it's the voice of lived experience that built the treatment system itself. All right, final share, and then we'll wrap it up. There we go. And this sounds like it comes in mid-system because the tapes, this went from number 9 to number 10, midstream, so I couldn't make it not midstream.
Side, we are beginning to see recovery as a new organizing concept within addiction treatment. We're beginning to see pushes towards this concept of long-term recovery management. People are beginning to challenge about wrapping recovery management within recovery-oriented systems of care. We're getting new roles like the recovery coaches, et cetera. So lots of things going on over here on the parallel. What's amazing, though, is what's going on in the middle. We got basically a new recovery advocacy movement. We're beginning to see new recovery support institutions and a culture of recovery emerging beyond anything that has historically existed in the United States. We're beginning to see these kind of advocacy posters. We're beginning to see recovery is everywhere campaigns launched not by addiction treatment programs, but by local grassroots recovery community organizations. We are beginning to see the mobilization of people in recovery. In 2001, recovery advocates came together in St. Paul, Minnesota, and launched what has become known as the New Recovery Advocacy Movement. We are now seeing an explosive rebirth of grassroots recovery community organizations that are not mutual aid societies and they are not addiction treatment programs. Historically, we didn't even have a category to talk about them. In these new recovery support organizations, we're seeing recovery community organizations. We're seeing the development of recovery community centers whose primary purpose is offering non-clinical recovery support services for individuals and families in long-term recovery. We're beginning to see a growing recovery home movement in the United States. And by the way, the RCOs that are spreading in this country includes the Massachusetts Organization for Addiction Recovery, MORE, who was one of the early leaders in this movement. We're getting the spread of a recovery home movement that is almost beyond comprehension and off the books. These are unfunded for the most part. These are individuals in recovery coming together, recognizing it's not enough to have a commitment to recovery. They got to have a world they can recover in. And they're beginning to build the physical space where that recovery can occur by joining together with other recovery people living in these houses with very simple democratic self-governance that says, don't pick up and pay the rent.
All right, so that's Bill White, William White. If you're not familiar with him, he has just done such incredible work on the substance use side. And his videos are great. They're just, he's not a peer supporter. He's worked in the field since the 60s, but he's just really great. So we come from different systems, but in the end, I think the most important thing that we can say is it's about two people who have a shared journey, who can share what they've experienced in the hope that it will help inspire, educate, and help more people to live the life that they were truly born to live, and that so many of us would not have had we not had that inspiration from someone else who had been there. And that's that. Phew! Thank
Lynn,
you.
that was a lot. So Lynn, when Lynn said she wanted to do a bunch of videos, I said, really, Lynn? That's a lot of transition. And she said, nope, we're going to figure this out through technology. And you did it. So congratulations, Lynn.
Well, we can't say it the way they said it, you know?
Yeah, it's amazing. And I appreciate all the resources and links to those videos. Somebody asked if the videos are available in public.
They're all YouTube. Everyone else is out of YouTube.
They're all on YouTube, so that's great. So we will make sure that the recording of this is sent out. It's put on our Facebook page. Next week, we're going to talk about the difference between peer support and case management. So that is, I see a lot of smiles in the head.
Oh boy, do we have plans for that one.
That is going to be very interesting. We're starting to get into the meat of peer support. So please join us on Friday. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Lynn. Bye.
Aaron.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome very much.
Thank everyone. Thank you.
Bye, Leanne.
Abby, this is my email. And Jareen has it if you don't get it, but there it is.
Good job, Lynn.
Oh man, that was challenging.
Okay, make sure that you stop the recording.
I will. I'm going to do it right now.
Thank y'all.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And I'll send that recording. That will come to me, so I'll send it over or post it. Are you posting? Where are you posting it?
I've been posting it on Facebook, but also sending it out. So if you can send it to me, I'll make sure that we post it.
Yep.
Hey, Lynn.
Yes.
This is Abby.
Hi, Abby.
How are you doing?
Good. Better now.
This was amazing. I so appreciate